welcome to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clemente, retired FBI profiler and former New York City prosecutor, and we're here once again to talk about People versus O.J. Simpson, the finale episode. And with me today is...
Laura Richards, founder of Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service and criminal behavioural analyst.
And Lisa Zambetti, casting director for Criminal Minds, where I work with my dear friend, Jim Clemente.
So, episode 10, the finale of People versus O.J. Simpson. It's called The Verdict, which was the crescendo of this whole series. The fact that the verdict came in within 4 hours of the judge telling the jury that they should start deliberations. And I think there was a lunch break in there, too.
Actually, wasn't just 4 hours. They actually broke on a Friday. So they actually had the weekend to kind of think about, not that they deliberated, but then they came back on Monday and it was basically 4 hours with a lunch break. So really they deliberated for 2 hours.
On Friday? Or,
on Monday.
Oh, and
because then it took more time to fill out the actual paperwork.
Got it. Wow. Crazy. Anyway, after a 9-month trial, that doesn't seem like they actually sat down and considered and discussed all the evidence. It sounds like they literally did just vote on emotion. And that's unfortunate because that's not what the process is supposed to entail. But it starts out, this episode, with a bang. Judge Ito made a colossal mistake in allowing O.J. Simpson to basically stand up and make a statement in open court. This is something that's not done. He's allowed to waive his right to take the stand. When he does that and the defense rests, then closing statement should start. But instead, Judge Ito, in one more attempt to bend over backwards for the defense, allows the defendant, without the benefit of cross-examination, to stand up in court and make a statement about his guilt or innocence. It's just totally inappropriate. There's no place for that in a court of law, in a criminal court. It just doesn't happen.
I mean, is Ito saying that because the jury isn't there, that's why it's okay that he allows it?
But the cameras are there. The public is listening. It's a public statement that he gave O.J. an opportunity to do without the benefit of cross-examination. In a criminal court, if the defendant wants to speak publicly, he should do so from the stand, and he should do so with cross-examination.
And that's the point Marcia makes.
Yes.
I mean, for me, it's absolutely incredulous that that decision was taken. And, no other defendant would be able to exercise such a privilege. And the fact of, what was being said was so manipulative.
Right.
And certainly that was obviously what Cochrane was anticipating. But even Marcia strongly objecting, Cochrane kind of gets another home win by putting it down to, you fear the truth, rather than actually this is a total breach of process. And it's a complete anomaly for this to happen.
Yeah, he has no right to do it, and the judge should never have allowed it. But this is what he said. Good morning, Your Honor. As much as I would like to address some of the misrepresentations about myself and my Nicole and our life together, I am mindful of the mood and the stamina of this jury. So basically he's blaming the jury and their stamina and their mood on why he isn't taking the stand. In other words, what he's supposed to be doing is saying, Your Honor, I waive my right to take the stand and testify in my own defense. Instead, he says, I would have done that to correct these misinterpretations or misrepresentations. And then he does this, my Nicole. I mean...
the personal pronoun.
Power and control, right? Like he owned her. They were divorced for how many years?
Well, for 2, but, obviously she had said that she did not want this relationship to continue, and yet he is still sowing that seed that they were still very much together.
But I'm sure in his mind he thinks it's an endearment, like my Nicole, like how much I loved her.
Right. Well, in his mind, but it shows, I think it's leakage about his need to control her. So that's the first sentence, and I believe that he is putting the blame on the jury, basically not taking responsibility himself for not testifying. There's a damn good reason why he didn't testify. I think they dramatized it pretty well, where they brought in a a lawyer to cross-examine him like Marcia Clark would, and the answers that he gave were horrendous and would have really created trouble for him on the stand. Then he says, I have confidence, a lot more it seems than Miss Clark. Miss Clark. Okay? He calls her Miss Clark, again, trying to be in a position of power over her. Of their integrity, and that they will find, as the record stands now, that I did not, could not, and would not have committed this crime. So, again, he's actually addressing the jury in these comments, and he's complimenting them, hoping, I'm sure, that the information gets back to them.
Filter through. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think he came up with this himself. I think Cochran and the lawyers
Wordsmithed
scripted
it.
this.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
really believe it. And then he goes on to say, I have 4 kids. 2 kids I haven't seen in a year. They ask me every week, Dad, how much longer before this trial is over? This is a direct slap in the face to the Browns and the Goldmans. They will never see their daughter or their son again. They will never have the opportunity to hug them, to enjoy their lives together. And he's saying, I don't get to see my sons. It's just...
But it's highly manipulative, because what it's also reminding the jury of, I've got these children who desperately want their daddy, they've lost their mummy, and they desperately need me. So please think very carefully about your decision, because these children need their dad.
Yeah, it's just terrible. And then finally, Marcia kind of coughs a little bit to indicate to Judge Ito, even as ridiculous as this opportunity you gave him was, I mean, he's going way too far. And so Judge Ito cuts him off and saying, Mr. Simpson, do you understand your right to testify as a witness? You choose to rest your case at this. And he said, I do. And Ito said, all right. I believe Ito was totally played by the defense one more time, that he was incompetent and biased in the way he ran this trial. And this is just the quintessential example of that.
I mean, this for me is just the absolute showstopper, allowing this to happen. And as Marcia quite rightly says, and again, she seems very angry. So the way that she comes across, but actually when you understand the process, she knows that there is a complete privilege being exercised on behalf of the defence. And, she said that if you want to talk about misrepresentation of Nicole, then go ahead and take a seat in the blue chair. And that's what should have happened. You can't say something and not expect a cross on it. And again, this complete privilege of saying something in a vacuum that he knows will trickle back, it may well have had a profound impact on the decision that was taken, this last-ditch attempt to manipulate things before the closing statements are made.
Yeah, and if the jury broke between Friday and Monday, then they would have had an opportunity to talk to their spouses and significant others and so forth. And that information was out in the public. It wasn't sequestered in a jury in a courtroom with only the judge and the prosecutor and the defense attorneys there. It was out in the world because this stuff was being broadcast and watched by many, many millions of people across the country.
It's completely outrageous.
Yeah, it's just... But as I said, it's a perfect example. It's a metaphor for everything else that he did during this trial, and it's shameful. But then we get to the closing arguments, and I have to correct an inaccuracy that happened in this show, where they showed Marcia Clark and then Chris Darden doing sequential closing arguments. That's not how it's done in a court of law. The prosecution does their opening closing statement, their first closing statement, then the defense goes, and then the prosecution is able to do a second closing. And it's because it's their burden of proof, they get a chance to address anything that the defense brought up. They get to hold back things that they want to say to the jury in the second instance. And they just for dramatic purposes in this case, put Marcia Clark and Darden's statements together
Back to
and
back,
then and then had Johnny Cochran go. But let's talk about Marcia Clark's statement. I thought it was a very good strategy move that she got Furman out of the way
Right at
from
the
the
top.
start.
She's like,
Yeah, this guy's disgusting. He should have never been a cop. He should never have been in this courtroom. And we obviously didn't know the extent of that. I think she should have fallen on her sword a little bit further, that she should have said it was a mistake calling him, but she should have then recounted she did a good job of recounting, running through the evidence in a very simple, direct way. I thought that was very good.
It was. It was very easy to understand. And actually, it was just a reminder for me when I heard her talk through, each kind of bite of the DNA, for example, of just how significant and overwhelming the forensic evidence was.
Right. And just and the logistics of it, and the Bronco not being there, the Bronco then showing up, and then somebody jumping over the wall, and the limo driver seeing OJ walk into his house. He wasn't there minutes before, and now he comes out. I mean, just and with a ready-made excuse and so forth. I think it was really well done. The only thing I think she should have harped on a little bit more was the fact that there's no way humanly possible for Furman to have planted this information, this glove and the blood evidence. He would never have been able to know that this is the place and the time to do that, because he had no idea where OJ was or where he had been. And it's just a terrible, horrible coincidence that one of the detectives that happened to respond that night happened to be a racist and a multi-ist. All those other ists that we were talking about.
Or isms.
Or isms, yes. There were so many other cops and detectives and witnesses who saw all the information, all the evidence there and so forth, that before Furman even got there, the only piece of evidence that he found that he was the first one to see would be that glove that he found at Rockingham. And again, it would have been impossible for him to know when he was at Bundy that he should pick up this glove and take it to OJ's house, because again, he wouldn't have any way of knowing where OJ was at the time, whether he was at a bar in front of 100 witnesses or on TV at that time, or in another state. So it would have just destroyed a murder investigation completely if he had done it. In the end, his statements and his racism and hatred actually did destroy this case, I believe.
Maybe she felt she didn't want to draw more attention to it again and go back over that old ground. And what she was trying to get them maybe to do was focus on the evidence. And I think once she started to list, I quite like the board that they had, whether that triangle was actually something that was used where, it's got domestic violence at the top of it. And they'd obviously made a conscious decision that Darden would take that aspect and she would go through and list all of the forensics that were found. And I think when you understand that list, so the shoe print that's a size 12 that plays out in the civil trial actually far more than it does in the criminal trial, which we'll get onto, but that he wears size 12 Bruno Magli shoes as well, and the hair being consistent that's found on the dark knit cap. The hair consistent with the defendant is also found on Ron Goldman's shirt. The gloves also found at Rockingham have fibres that match Ron's hair. Ron's blood, Nicole's blood, the defendant's blood, the glove size, which is extra large. OJ wears extra large, and they presented a picture of him actually wearing those gloves at football games. As you mentioned, Jim, the limo driver, saying the Bronco wasn't outside when he arrived and then was as they left.
Before this guy jumped over the wall, and then OJ appeared.
Absolutely. And then, going into the blood at Bundy matches the defendant at a rate of 1 in 170 million, which was lost when the prosecution made that point before. Nicole's blood was on the defendant's sock, a matching 1 in 6.8 billion. I mean, it's billion that we're talking. That was an oh my God moment for me, hearing that. And then the blood on the rear gate at Bundy matches the defendant at a rate of 1 in 57 billion. And I think it's very poignant when Marcia says there are only 5 billion people on the planet. Yeah. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is an identification.
Yeah, that jumped out at me too, and I don't know if it's totally accurate, but she seemed much better at describing this evidence in her clothes than she did earlier on in the trial.
Absolutely. I mean, really important points to reinforce. And then the behavioural, the nuanced part, which again, we've talked about in another episode, but when she says that when the defendant's asked about his wife's death, at no point does he ask, how did she die?
Hello, it's Jim Clementi and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
So, those things match together, but I think it's significant, the forensic evidence that they highlight when we're thinking about beyond reasonable doubt. Yes, it was embryonic at the time, but we're talking about, millions and billions. And, it wasn't an exact science, it was a new science at that time, but these things seem to be lost. In any form of real deliberation about the key facts, not the emotion or the mood, but the facts of what was presented.
I agree. It's just unbelievable how overwhelming this case was. And it's not the question of, is there any kind of doubt? It has to be a reasonable doubt. And the claims that the defense made about this conspiracy and the ability of these cops to magically create evidence in places and times where it would have been impossible to do. And the fact is that there was more evidence that the jury never got to hear. I don't know why they never got to hear about the $8,700 in cash, the passports, the fake beard, the fake mustache, and the glue to put it on his face.
And the boat in the
Bronco.
Bahamas.
Yeah, the boat in the Bahamas, all this stuff that just never came out in trial for some reason. There were also statements that were made during that chase to the police, to the dispatcher, and just about OJ saying that his kids would never forgive him. And that being one of the things that he's talking about when he's on his sort of suicide death ride. And
I mean, his letters could have been presented that he wrote as confession letters, and I don't know why that didn't happen. And certainly, Darden goes on to paint a very vivid picture of Nicole's life and picks up, I know it's in the wrong order, Jim, but,
yeah, I know.
Picks up the domestic violence history.
Right.
And, reiterates exactly what was going on. And I think one of the interesting things that we didn't cover, but there was a nod to threatening letters that OJ had written her that was also in the safety deposit box, which, would have been very interesting to see and to analyse.
I've never seen them out anywhere. I wonder where they are and why those were never disclosed.
Well, they must have been to some extent, because he couldn't have argued about the pictures and the diary unless it was actually in evidence. Otherwise, they should have objected to it. So somehow...
But he didn't argue the diary. I mean, he just argued facts. He went back to his sort of metaphor of the ticking time bomb, which actually, that's exactly how I would describe what was going on here, and says that the fuse was lit in 1985. And he takes them back factually, as opposed to talking about... exactly what was the content of the letters, etc., but much more about the fact that there were call-outs to the police and, the things that we had detailed, that, the domestic abuse, the fuse was lit in 1985, the year they were married, with officers responding after OJ beat her and took a baseball bat to her Mercedes. And then in 1989 when she calls 911 again, and he vividly describes how she runs to the officers saying, he's going to kill me,
Right.
Which, how prophetic. And then the fact that, she tells the police, I've called you 8 times and you never do anything about it. And that all this evidence points to OJ.
Right.
And the fact that there's nobody else for them to talk about. There's nobody else's forensics. There's nobody else's DNA. But in 1992, she files for divorce and she's trying to run away from the man that she knows will kill her.
Right.
And then he gives a nod. He basically says that she filled the safety deposit box with the threatening letters from the defendant, a will, police photos of past beatings. And, you know, these threatening letters, she knew that that bomb would go off at any time. And, you know, that's what she was running from. But the interesting point, again, for me that he talks about is that night. You know, that night at the dance show where apparently OJ was eyeballing her the whole time, was watching her, was clearly very angry. And I wonder how many people witnessed that within, you know, the dance hall, as it were, seeing that he's riled up and amped, because we didn't hear anything about
No.
those witnesses being called.
No.
And in terms of what, you know, we think how it went down, I mean, they would be key people to understand that, which puts a conversation between them prior to the dance show.
Right. It's the kind of thing where understanding the behavior of somebody who has a long history of domestic violence, somebody who has escalating behavior in that arena, and then seeing the culmination and not gluing the pieces together in that trial, I think was a big mistake. I think we'll see that in the civil trial, it was all about domestic violence, but here it wasn't, and that's really unfortunate. I thought one of the great things that Darden did was actually point at O.J. Simpson and say, I'm not afraid to point at him and say he's guilty. And it's not about the N word, it's about the M word, murder. This is what this trial is about. And I thought that was very well done on his part, because he had to prove that he had the guts to say O.J. is guilty of murder before he's going to let or challenge the jury to make that determination. So,
I mean, I'd agree. I thought it was a fairly, you know, ballsy move to do that. But the other thing I would say is that it also harks back to the N-word, that opening speech. And unfortunately, it would take the jury back to that too. And I sometimes think, you know, you've got to pick and choose those things, haven't you? Do you want to take them back to some of the blunders that happened at the start? But calling him out and saying those things and making it clear that this was about an angry man, you know, who had been spurned, that's how he was presenting at the dance show. Because without, as you said, Jim, without piecing it together, it just seems this jump of, well, nothing happened. And then, you know, a number of years before they'd divorced, and then it appears, well, not much had happened, and suddenly it's this big jump. But actually, there isn't a big jump. She talked of finality and that it was finally over. And if other people saw him sat there seething and being angry, then, you know, there's a time window from her then going to dinner with 11 of them, and him not being at that dinner, and then him knowing, you know, roughly what time she would be getting home. And that's what Darden's talking about, that time bomb. The time bomb actually chooses when it goes off. And, you know, these are very controlled acts that, yes, when there's lots of public people around, they're in a public space, there's very little OJ can do. But he bides his time. And that's the thing. This is all about a control and trying to take control, because he felt that he was losing it. He was losing that person, Nicole, even though they're divorced. And I thought Darden did lay that out. But I would have liked to have heard that far more in the body of the trial, and bringing all of those people in to give their, you know, testimony.
yeah, the fact that they never called the domestic violence expert on the part of the prosecution, I think just I can't understand that. I can't understand it at all. But also the fact that Judge Ito would allow one letter from Nicole to OJ when she was basically trying to take some blame herself, as opposed to all the other letters that she
Epistemic
wrote,
imbalance.
all the other documentation she made it so that law enforcement would know what happened. I mean, Darden made a great point. Why do you put these letters in this journal in a safe deposit box with the police photos of her being beaten and your will? I mean, it shows
it's like...
an incredible foresight and
Well, she was clear.
prescience.
I mean, I see women do that all the time, you know, or they go and report it to the police just in case, you know, the inevitable happens. That's why people call the police. That's why 911s and 999s happen, you know, because people fear they're in immediate danger. And when they're not getting that response, they feel the need to plan for themselves. So what did you think about Cochrane, who then jumps up on his feet? Well, after a pause, there's
Yes.
obviously some drama and that he likes to create for his closing.
Yeah, I thought that Cochrane's statement, though strategic, sort of trying to side with the victims of domestic violence right from the start, was disgusting, given his own history and his own ability to slip out of responsibility for beating his own wife. That it was completely hypocritical.
It was. I mean, grandstanding, bravado, complete hypocrisy. Oh, and not to mention the fact, if we believe the portrayal, OJ is sat there crying. Who does that remind you of?
Crocodile tears, right?
Crying his crocodile tears throughout what Darden's saying, and then when Cochrane starts to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of Oscar Pistorius, actually.
A certain South African
Yes, who hopefully we'll be talking about shortly, because he's coming back for a hearing.
and there are some real parallels between these two cases,
Definitely.
sadly.
So, Cochrane made a few bad, or I want to say, well, I think they're lies. I think they're deliberate lies. He said Furman found the gloves. That is absolutely a lie. Furman found a glove at Rockingham. He did not find the gloves at Bundy. They were found by the first responding officers and at least 4 officers who had been there before Furman arrived. So that was a misstatement or a lie.
Do you think it was intentional?
Of course. I mean, he because his next statement, Furman is not just Furman. He represents the entire LAPD, which is another bald-faced lie.
Incredulous.
I mean, first of all, guess what, Johnny? There are a vast number of minorities on the LAPD that is not represented. Furman is not representative of the type of people that are on the LAPD. That's just absolutely ridiculous. But he said it, so he wanted people to believe it. He said it's all about race, that it's genocide.
He likens him to Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
So
He goes for it. He goes all the
does.
way in.
Which again, is to distract because of the fact. I mean, for me, it's about the fact that at no point does he decide to tackle the evidence that the prosecution put forward. So
Doesn't
this is
even mention
again
it.
doesn't
Yeah.
mention it, doesn't address it in any way, which tells you a lot. As Jim and I always say, it's not about what's always present; it's about what's absent. And he doesn't take it on because he knows that he cannot, but he goes for the things that he can win. And the things that he can win is going back to race and vilifying all of LAPD and making it clear in the jury's mind that's what they should be focusing on, not the murders of Nicole and Ron.
It's a distraction. And, when he says, if the glove doesn't fit, then you must acquit. That's not actually true. You don't have to acquit just because the glove doesn't fit. And the glove pretty much did fit. And the glove certainly would have fit better if he didn't have rubber gloves on or latex gloves on underneath. And maybe, as Robert Kardashian later said, he stopped taking his arthritis medicine a month before, and his hands would likely have swelled up as opposed to what they would have been like with the medication. So there's all
Well, and
sorts
the
of...
tests that would be run on the gloves as well. So it'd have chemicals in them. There'd be all sorts of
Yeah.
reasons, as you said. I mean, certainly latex gloves underneath, trying to put a leather on top of it.
It's difficult to do in under the best circumstances. And as I said earlier, I think they should have bought a new pair of those gloves. And right after that debacle, they should have said, here, try these on. This is what they would have been like when you bought them, when Nicole gave them to you because she bought them. So I just think that whole if they don't fit, you must acquit. I mean, it's a mockery of the system. He's acting the clown, and I just don't know why he got away with it throughout that whole trial. But I'm not surprised that he did it in the closing because he got away with it. Judge Ito bent over backwards for him.
Right. And so now we move to jury deliberation.
Yes, the jury room. Well, the first thing they did was take a vote, and they are supposed to vote after deliberation, not before deliberation. They are not supposed to be using racial pressure to get people to change their votes. They're supposed to be using the evidence. Now, again, I wasn't in that jury room.
Yeah.
The writers of the show were not in that jury room. I don't know what really happened in that jury room, but I do believe that there was a divide, a very dramatic racial divide on that jury, and I think that mirrored what was going on in society as a whole at the time. Orchestrated, of course, by Johnny Cochran.
Well,
You don't agree?
I hear that. I just wonder. There was a telling line that they had about he may have done it, but I don't think they proved it. I think one of the jurors said, and so they're splitting hairs on that point.
Except, well, that's the statement that was made in this dramatic
Yeah.
representation of what happened in the jury room. But in fact, they didn't deliberate on the evidence. They didn't go over 9 months worth of testimony in a couple of hours. They didn't discuss it. They didn't say, okay, well, what did you think about this? What did you think about that witness? What did you think about this witness? What did you think about the scientist that came in? And what did you think about the fact that logistically, isn't it impossible for somebody to have done this, this, and this? They had less than 4 hours to deliberate 9 months of testimony. They
Probably
asked for
whittled down
one.
to 2, as you say, with a break, with paperwork.
Yeah, they asked for the testimony to be read of the limo driver, and that was it. That's the only evidence that they actually asked to have the transcripts of that testimony brought in. So it must have been that somebody raised an issue about that, and then they brought in that testimony. They read that testimony to them, and then they should deliberate more on that testimony or other things.
But I think Lisa was right that a juror did speak out and did say that the sticking point, and I think I remember seeing a juror on a show talking to Kim Goldman, and she made the point that, as a juror, I just didn't feel that it had been proven beyond reasonable doubt.
Well, that's easy for them to say. I mean,
Well-
but if you made up your mind, well, if you're actually in the deliberation process, you should go into that room without having made up your mind. You should not go into that room saying guilty or not guilty.
But
You
how
should
is
say,
it possible not through months to try to be weighing the hang on, to be weighing the evidence as it's presented to you? Of course, you're keeping your mind open for more evidence that's going to be presented, but you are judging things. The human mind can't not do that. And then when you get to the end of the trial, of course you have an opinion, and you can be happy to change that opinion as you discuss it, but you can't walk
Okay.
into that room without a feeling.
which is the basic dilemma and what I talked about earlier about this jury process. These are not experts. They don't really understand a lot of the science. They don't have the ability to not predetermine what's going on. They have to as human beings. They should be taking notes all along. You
Yeah.
couldn't even read all the notes you took over 9 months in that number of hours. So how could you possibly really consider them? But you're in a situation when you're in that room where, if they portrayed that accurately, where people said, no, right here as I sit, I will never change my vote. I will never change my vote from not guilty. No matter what anybody says, no matter what evidence somebody brings up, no matter what deliberations happen here, I will not change my vote. That is not doing what you're actually charged to
I
do as a
agree.
juror. So I don't know. Again, it may not have happened. That may have just been the way they represented it in this show. But if they did it that way, it's just not the process. And this is one of the problems with the jury trial. It's a benefit, certainly, but it's also a hindrance. I do not believe that you can get people to really wrap their heads around complicated scientific and legal issues when they have no training in that.
I disagree with you, especially how, if Marcia did do her closing this way, she explained it in a way that anybody could understand.
Yeah,
But
5
anyway.
minutes or 10 minutes or even an hour or 2 hours if her closing was that long. But she didn't summarize every piece of evidence. She just hit some points. And what a jury is supposed to do is consider all the evidence, and they're supposed to deliberate. They're supposed to discuss that.
Yeah.
And as it was depicted, it just became we know who voted not guilty. And it's a shame because I believe, as I've said before, that this is an example of jury nullification. And jury nullification is a concept that's everybody knows about in the law. They don't talk about it much, but the jury can make a decision because they're human beings. They can make a decision based on emotion. And I think that was exactly what was portrayed in this series. And I think they brought it out a number of times in this last episode.
Yeah, and I mean, I would agree with both of you in different ways. One, in the sense that, you know, people will make judgments no matter what you say. But, you know, so people do go into the room with a preconceived conclusion. And I think that probably happens a lot. But I agree with Jim, you know, the actual process is about deliberating.
Right.
And it depends what you're deliberating on. And I don't think they were deliberating on whether he killed Nicole and Ron. I think they actually were voting on something very different. You know, and they were voting really on which version of events do they believe, that this is a trial about LAPD, this is a trial about O.J. Simpson as a black man in the black community, and they weren't deliberating on the evidence regarding the murders. So that due process was not followed, and how could it be? I agree with Jim. It's not possible to follow that and deliberate and to throw around different points of view within 2 to 4 hours. So every strand of the evidence, you know, of what they're basing their decision on wasn't deliberated upon. There was a very clear sense that people knew or felt that they did, and the way it was portrayed is that the two women, who both were white, had two different views. And then it was down to peer pressure in many senses.
Do you think that was articulated that
What was
way?
portrayed
No, I
in
mean,
the show,
it just
and of course we don't know.
imagining- Right.
We
But
don't
would you
know what
imagine
went
that
down
they
in the
would
room.
articulate that this is going to be payback? Because you know that why I'm bringing this up, because we had a listener write a very emotional email, which I completely understand, and so I'm trying to look at it from the eyes of someone who says a group of people weren't out to do anything as a group mind.
Well,
That every individual had their point of view. You know
well,
what I'm saying?
you know, that is a great theory, but what I'm saying is that is not what this show depicted in any way,
No, yeah, I
shape,
agree.
or form.
I agree.
I mean, this show, the very first scenes were about Rodney King being beaten and then the officers getting acquitted in that case. That's how this show actually created a historical context for this
Sure.
trial.
Absolutely.
And so, right from the very first instant of this show, or not the first instant, but I mean, close to the first instant, they were setting the stage of racial unrest.
Tensions, and that was the zeitgeist at the time.
Right.
I mean, it was, whether, you know, the people don't want it to be, but actually that was the zeitgeist. And I don't think there's any getting away from that.
Right. And
And how it was depicted. And we're talking about how it was depicted in this show was what went down in that jury. Now, only those people know exactly what went down, what those conversations were. But I would imagine in 2 to 4 hours there isn't too much deliberation.
Right, and I really appreciate the listener who wrote in, and she took the time to then answer in much more detail when you asked her to. That's great. We really appreciate that, because this is a dialogue. You know, we are going back and forth with people who listen to this, and we have done that. We do that all the time in our real lives. So I'm really happy that that happens. But when I made the statement earlier, it was before I saw the finale of this show. But I made the statement based on the reality of what I lived through. I remember the case very well. And I was working with Dr. Lee, who was a witness in the trial at the time in Fort Marcy Park in Washington, D.C. I remember very much the coverage that showed the racial divide. But also in the finale, it was depicted not only literally in one of the African-American jurors raising his fist in the Black Power sign to OJ at the end. He was, if that actually happened, I don't know, because we couldn't see the jury in the real world.
It was actually, in the fact check, they say that really did happen.
Well, then that is absolute proof of what I was saying. I'm not saying that he represented every single African-American person on that jury, but there certainly was African-Americans who believed that this was a way to get back at white justice because they have mistreated African Americans in this country for hundreds of years. That's something that I and my family have fought against since, when I was a little kid. I remember my uncle helping to get African Americans in the South registered to vote. I remember all sorts of different things. I mean, I worked civil rights cases while I was an FBI agent. There are a number of ways that I have run into that in the course of my life, and I hate it. I don't like it at all, and I don't want it to happen in our justice system. But the fact is that when this trial happened in the real world, when Johnny Cochran had these, repeated press conferences where he was, almost literally threatening rioting if they didn't get a certain way in the decision by Ito, for example, about the tapes, that it was a deliberate attempt to try to divide the country. And then when the verdict was being read in the real world, the news covered a number of different locations live, watching people respond to the verdict being read. And it was a very dramatic difference between the reactions in African American communities and in white communities. And it's sad that they were able to create that mystique or that division around this case when it was actually a case about
two people
two
who were
people
murdered.
who were violently, brutally murdered. And it wasn't about the race of the people who were murdered and the race of the person who murdered them. It was about the fact that this is a deliberate attack on human lives, and it was basically erased in this case.
Yeah. The one thing I just want to say about the public's reaction to the verdict, and I very clearly remember where I was in a room full of people of all different races, and it's exactly as depicted. One half were aghast and horrified, and the other cheered, and I was shocked, But when I think of it now, especially thinking about our listener's letter, tell me if I'm crazy, but maybe, say when you go to the doctor and you have all these symptoms that you have a terrible disease and you're sure you have it, and you're just waiting for the doctor to come in and confirm the test results. And he comes in and he says, no, you don't have this disease. And you have this huge, oh, good, and the public seeing the verdict coming in, maybe saying, oh, maybe he is innocent. And it's that relief that, okay, well, if they say he's innocent, maybe they saw things in the evidence that maybe I, as a viewer, didn't see. Am I crazy?
Then how many, there are a certain number of African American people in this country, and there's a certain number of white people in this country. And O.J. Simpson was the darling superstar athlete for all races.
Sure.
Why would not the white people then feel the same if that's what really happened?
Well, as you said, because
it was drummed into their system for 9 months or almost a year, probably, during the preliminary hearings and so forth. All the press conferences that Cochran held as soon as he got the opportunity and through the trial, because he was trying to stir up that unrest. He did it deliberately. It was a tactic. And it was a tactic that I believe the judge should have controlled from the start and should have prevented from that point forward. So they could have had an isolated, which they needed, justice served for this particular set of victims. They didn't get justice because he was able to create all this distraction outside.
Which didn't happen in the civil trial, incidentally.
Yeah, exactly.
And we are going to cover that, but I think it's an important distinction. I mean, in the civil trial, race wasn't allowed to be used in the same way as the criminal trial because the judge ruled it was too speculative and explosive. But of course, in a civil trial, the burden of proof is much lesser because it's in all probability rather than beyond reasonable doubt. But I think it absolutely had a part to play here in people's reactions. I watched the Oprah, live, just watching her audience. And I also listened to their reactions as well, because that was the interesting point of putting a microphone around people and saying, explain your reaction. And, that was very clear. Of course, people have different views and different thoughts, but I certainly found it an odd thing, the very celebratory nature of of some people, when for me it's still the fact that two people have died. And actually, if it's not him, who is it? Because two people were brutally wiped out. And so it was a very interesting thing, just seeing in different communities is too big a word, because there's communities within communities, so it's very hard to kind of say in this community or that community. But obviously it did divide not just the country, I mean the world to a degree, because everyone was watching. This was the first time TV was in our courtrooms, and the UK was certainly watching, and most people worldwide were. Yeah. And that was the platform that Johnny Cochran also created, with all his press conferences and all the grandstanding and all the media circus around it. And, there were so many smoke screens and so much mud kicked up. And I do have to agree with Jim. He was trying to incite racial tension. When he called the press conference just before Judge Ito ruled on the tapes, that was a very deliberate move to put community leaders, in inverted commas, because as I say, I don't think any one person really represents a whole community, but he was pushing them to make certain statements and trying to rile people up and trying to put pressure on Ito. So it was always there as a theme throughout the whole thing.
Absolutely. I just would love to think that the jurors could see past that.
Well, but it was so emotionally charged, wasn't it? I mean, we forget the emotion, of the human being. We like to think that everybody goes into things completely professional and you take your heart and your emotions out of things. But this was such a volatile and an emotional case in so many senses, because you had somebody amping it up in the background like Johnny Cochran. Right. He said he had to be the ringmaster, get on the front end of it, and that's exactly what he did. He was amping it up at every opportunity.
Yeah, and when I am talking about this case, I'm not just talking about the show. I'm talking about having lived through it as an FBI agent at the time. I totally understand that this is a horrible result, that somebody was able to sort of rile the public up so that there would be a racial divide, because that served his purposes, period. And I think that in the show, though, when Darden confronted him at the end and said, African-American people didn't win here. There's not going to be anything changed unless you are famous and rich and you live in Brentwood. That's the only thing this proved, that rich people are able to manipulate the system to their benefit, period. And he made the statement, O.J. Simpson is the first African-American to get off of a crime because he's black. And the sad story is there are plenty of white people who got off on crimes because they were white or got light treatment. I mean, look at Affluenza Teen. I mean, it's just outrageous, that crap. And then there were plenty of African-American people who got horrendous judgments against them, convictions against them, death penalty against them.
Horrible.
Yeah, because they were black. And that needs to stop. But dividing the country doesn't create that, doesn't stop it. And that's what Darden was trying to say to them. So when I talk about it on the podcast, I'm not saying I don't agree that people should be racially divided. I don't put everybody in a box. I don't live my life that way.
Of course you don't.
I mean, but the fact is that is what was happening at the time. And I don't know if this, I'll write back to this. This listener and directly answer all her questions and raise whatever issues are in there. But I don't know if she lived through this time. I don't know if this is just a historical thing in the past and she's relying on the show to give her the information of what went on at that time. But I do know it. I lived through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and everything that happened during those times.
No, and I agree with you. You can tell I was very affected by this, very thoughtful listener. And it made me I think of myself as a liberal person. I grew up, for God's sakes, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I lived in New York. And but she really made me think, am I completely full of shit? I mean, maybe I am biased and have racism that I don't even know.
No, I don't think that's it at all. And I think, it's people make statements like, you can't know what it's like if you're not X. And that could be a female, it could be African American, it could be Asian American, it could be,
Could be lesbian
Muslim.
or gay.
Yes,
and-
it
Yeah.
could be any number of things that you don't know exactly what it's like. You don't. But I know you. You have empathy. You can understand that they're going through something. You can relate because you have your own things that you've gone through as a woman in business. You talked about personal things that happened to you in your relationship. I mean, every one of us has these things, and we can relate to other people. And just because I'm not fill in that blank in one particular thing does not mean that I don't have plenty of reason to want to help people get out of that. That I didn't dedicate my entire career to helping people. I mean, victims of crime, and whether that's, sexual victimization or murder or terrorists being tortured. I have stuck my neck out and protected people who were defenseless, protected people who are in a position where they can't do anything to help themselves. That's what our job is in law enforcement. And I know Laura and I have both spent our careers protecting victims. That's all we do. That's what our driving force is.
And
We're not
being their
perfect.
voice and standing
Yeah.
up for them when they cannot, and that's a challenge all the time. And as Jim said, it's not about you having had a shared experience. It's about, the Martin Luther King quote, if there's an injustice anywhere, it affects justice everywhere. And, that's I guess, the starting point with a case like this. I also think there were some other key points within the show as well. That last particular, 10 was just full of, it was just a roller coaster ride, I
was.
think. And, certainly there were some moments there when the exchange with the guard, for example, which was true.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, you're just seeing slightly different privileges, and the guard talking to OJ and saying, you don't need to be nervous, and I've been talking to my buddies up at where the jury are.
Right.
Oh, and can you sign my ball as well for for my son? And you just again see OJ register the fact that maybe he's going to get away with this, and maybe there's going to be a verdict in his favour.
Right.
Well, the other thing that guard statement kind of points to is that there must have been discussion of
People
the
talking.
case,
Of course.
during the 9 months, because otherwise, why would they
Exactly.
know that? So
Yeah, and even they're not guards are not certainly not supposed to share what's going on in that secret jury room. They're not supposed to be able to overhear, and they're not supposed to discuss it. So even that was clearly a crime.
And loose lips sink ships.
Yeah, there
I
you
mean,
go.
That's always what I was told when I was working in intelligence at the Metropolitan Police Service. And here you've got a prime example of information being leaked. I think, it was very moving, the press statements. Certainly, Marsha and Darden, very emotional trial and jury decision, being based on emotion. I thought that was interesting what the mayor said. But certainly with Marsha, I think she made some important points to not just, thank the families and pay tribute to them, and the fact that their dignity and strength, was just incredible and a true inspiration. But she also appealed to other victims. And I think that was a very important point to make, that, when you don't see justice being, meted out, that, she hoped and said that the verdict doesn't discourage others from seeking help.
I thought that
because-
was an amazing opportunity. Certainly, there were many millions of people listening to that, and I thought it was a great thing that she did that. Just before that, I mean, when the verdict was actually read, I think Ron's sister sobbing was just so tragic. I mean, she had hoped, beyond all hope, that her brother would get justice, and he didn't. And it's just, and then a little bit later, the scene where they're in the car.
Yeah.
What do we do now? She says to Mr. Goldman, and it's just, I can just totally feel for them and
Yeah.
empathize with their position. It was a little strange, though, that, and I don't know if this was how it actually went down, but when Darden only mentioned the Goldmans and not the Browns, and he went and hugged the Goldmans, but not the Browns. It was even strange that they were on separate sides of the podium. I mean, I don't know if that was, again, for dramatic effect or whatever, but I don't know if he did that in the real world. But I felt bad, of course, for the Browns as well. And just that terrible tragedy that was going to go on, that was going to happen shortly thereafter, where OJ got custody of the children of the mother that he murdered.
Yeah.
It's
Sydney
just,
and Justin, and he expected them to be at his home address as soon as he got home. But I think Darden. I've listened to an interview of his actually subsequently, and the bit where he's saying, and he gets overwhelmed, but saying that he's not angry and bitter, where actually he said he absolutely was, and
Yeah, I read that too.
has no idea why he said that, but got totally overwhelmed. And you can see what was at stake. You can see
Yeah.
what really mattered to
yeah,
him.
well, he resigned, and Marcia did too. But when actually Garcetti, the DA at the time, stood up, he said he's profoundly disappointed. And he said, just like I did in a previous podcast, that this was obviously a verdict based on emotion, not evidence. So it's obviously something that, I mean, they included that statement because it did kind of sum up the entirety of what they were trying to show. I'm talking about the writers of this actual show. But, I would imagine that just like the trial transcripts, that they probably stayed pretty close to truth when they did those final statements. But I really thought that it was the good thing about this episode, one of the greatest things, was that they finally addressed the families of the victims. They finally gave them, a little bit more humanity. You saw how profoundly affected they were by this, and it was wonderful to see that Marcia, sort of took that moment to not sort of wallow in her failure here, but to actually stand up for victims of domestic violence.
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously something that was, very close to her. And, that's something we don't see justice always be handed out or delivered. And actually, safety and justice are two very different things. But, certainly when victims do report to the police, it can actually escalate things. And, that is why advocacy services are so important, to be there, working with the victim, working with the police. But the fact she's saying, don't lose faith in the criminal justice system, I know it's a very bitter pill to swallow, because the trust and confidence, unfortunately, on a case like this is lost.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about a community, we're talking about victims, full stop. That's what they read. What's the point in calling the police? And if this is what's going to happen, I'd be really interested to know what the reporting rates were like after that.
Whether they went up or down.
Yeah, because I would have expected a decrease. Even though Marcia makes that plea, and she was right to have made it, but it really does show very serious consequences that can happen.
Right.
For all of those who are sat there watching it and thinking, well, what's the point?
And I don't know if the final scene between Darden and Cochran was accurate. Obviously, they may or may not have actually talked to Darden about it, but the fact that Cochran reportedly said, "This was war. You did a superb job, and I respect that. And when all the dust settles, I'll help bring you back into the community." And Darden says, "I never left the community." It wasn't like me not being part of the African American community by trying to prosecute the guy who murdered.
Exactly.
Just because he happened to be black doesn't mean that me not being black or not being part of the African American community. I mean, it just goes to show you how he inserted this spin on everything he did, and he didn't give a damn how he did it, just as long as he won. And that was exactly what happened. He just went for it in every way, shape, and form, and actually abused the system, in my mind. There was a really poignant discussion between Marcia Clark and Chris Darden at the end. And Laura, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very illuminating, wasn't it, that we suddenly get a real sense of what this trial means to both of them.
Yeah.
Darden says that he's had enough of the politics and image and everything else mattering before doing the good, and that he just can't do it anymore, and that he intends to resign. But
Which he did.
Which he did. And then Marcia saying, well, maybe you're lucky that, this isn't for you, but maybe you have to have something inside you, the thing that drives you and something that you want to make right and to avenge. And then we get the disclosure about her truth and her raison d'etre, of why she does the work that she does, and the fact that she was raped at 17 by a waiter in Italy, and that she had buried that, which, you know, must have come at huge consequence to her, but it eventually comes out when she tries her first rape case. And of course, you can't keep lids on those sorts of boxes, even however much you want to compartmentalise, and that she had to try and deal with everything that she was feeling emotionally and psychologically. But she then felt that she wanted vengeance for victims, and, you know, that's what justice is to her, and that she felt very strongly that when she is in a courtroom and she looks at a jury, that they share that same thing in common, that everyone wants justice for the victims. So I think it's huge humility on her part, but also she doesn't use that, you know, badge in inverted commas as a victim. And it's not laced throughout this, but she clearly has a very strong calling in terms of the work that she does. And I know many in the sector that I work with have also endured, and that's been their experience, and that's what makes them very good advocates, because they have been exposed and they have survived something, and it makes them understand all the nuanced details and the context. And, you know, fighting for others and standing up for them is, you know, it shows huge humility on her part. And that's the burning thing that keeps her going. And that's also the reason why she takes such a hit in this case in particular, because if you don't get justice, this is the one trial that she's lost, remember, in that context, and she doesn't get justice for Nicole and Ron. So it's that scene of, where does she go from here if you don't believe in the system anymore? And that's what she was talking about. If you don't believe in the system anymore, and that burning thing of getting justice for victims, how can you get over that when you don't believe in the criminal justice system?
Yeah, and I have to tell you, I can relate absolutely to that. And it's one of the reasons why I left the prosecutor's office in New York City. I write about that case in my book, Without Consent. And it was a case where a young boy was victimized, and it was a really horrible case. But the boy did an amazing job testifying on the stand, but the attorney played every
Trick in the
game he
book.
could. Yeah, he did everything he could. I mean, this 8.5, 9-year-old boy was on the stand, and he tried to confuse him. He tried to do all this stuff. And he shouted and yelled and screamed and waved his hands a lot, and the judge just listened to him.
What did the judge do?
The judge did nothing to protect the child, and my attempts to protect the child were then, he alleged that was prosecutorial misconduct, and because that the boy was actually testifying for me. And literally, the judge ended up dismissing the case and saying that she felt that he was too well rehearsed. And I then pointed out to her, one, that she granted 6 adjournments for the defense on the day of trial, which meant I had to prep him every time. And so if he was well rehearsed, it's the defendant's fault. But then I said there wasn't a thing that he testified to that wasn't in the initial complaint on the first day I met him. And in fact, in the complaint to the police department even before I met him. So what is it that he testified to for me? How did I change his testimony? And she said, I did fail to consider that, but it's too late now. I'm telling you, and that was enough. Let me just say, by the end of that conversation, she said, I don't want you in my courtroom ever again. I had given her a piece of my mind, and I'm sure that I might have said a few things that were rude and abusive to her, but she deserved it in my mind. So anyway, that was one of the sort of last straws that I said, I cannot sit here and put another victim through this process because it is torturous. And so I ended up going into the FBI, where I thought I can do a better job making the investigation just so airtight that the cases will never go through to trial, that the cases will be so well put together that the defendant, if he's guilty, is going to plead guilty and not try to fight it in court, because the victims just get victimized a second time.
And that's why you feel so strongly, and you've ensured that good practice and all those things are used throughout your
Absolutely.
whole career. And I think that's incredible, Jim. And certainly for Marsha, I think listening to that scene, I felt quite overwhelmed actually. Hearing her journey, and the fact that she said that all the jury really seemed to hear was that yes, he beat her, he snuffed her out, but they let him go for reasons that have nothing to do with those two people, and or that's what her interpretation of it was, and that she basically had nowhere to go following that.
Yeah. But, I mean, she did actually go on with a career, and she's written books, and she's been a commentator, and she's spoken around the world. And I have to say that I learned a new level of respect for her in the course of watching some of those statements that she made and her appearances and listening to what she actually was going through that I didn't know at the time. So I'm very happy that now I feel better educated and that I was wrong when I saw what I saw, because it was only a limited glimpse of what was really happening. I didn't understand the context at the time, but now I do.
The judgments that we make. But remember, I mean, she does say it was the worst 15 months of her life, and she reinvented herself. I mean, she stepped away from this entirely. So although, I think it's come at huge personal cost to her, in terms of it was a complete gear change.
Right, and I had misinterpreted that as her playing up to the cameras as opposed to her being sort of forced into that position where she didn't really have a choice. And especially if her boss kept telling her, you got to go see these stylists and so forth.
So after the verdict, they go, they take the story a little bit farther along, and they kind of show what sort of happened when OJ got home and everything. And apparently his son really did give him a puppy, which is bizarre. But anyway.
Well, what's bizarre about it was he said, I wanted to make sure you always had a friend. And so did he really say that to his father? Like I'm not going to be your friend, or other people aren't going to be your friends anymore? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, but it was meant to show that supposedly that OJ had a hard time afterwards, that he couldn't get back with his white country club friends. They didn't want him anymore, that Bob Kardashian left him and put the Bible down, and rejected him that way. And reportedly, they never spoke again
Really?
after that.
didn't know that.
They completely cut off ties with him. And I think that would be, quite a testament to Mr. Kardashian, because he would have cut off a friendship for many decades because he actually did care about Nicole.
And he did understand the forensic science, and he couldn't get his head round the blood. And of course, we know that he took the Louis Vuitton bag that was OJ's. So perhaps he did understand more than what he ever talked about. Right. And I know he did speak at the bar with Barbara Walters, but I mean, I don't know how close to, or where they would get those accounts from. But
Did he actually take evidence out of OJ's house? Did he actually find something in there that would have made him know that
Incriminated
OJ was
him.
guilty?
As a profiler, you guys, when you watch his real reaction to the verdict, what do you see?
Well, I see somebody who understands that his best friend has just gotten away with murder. But, is that a real depiction? The fact he has eyeball with Marsha, there's that very pregnant, understanding between them. The fact that they portray it of him rushing to the toilet and being sick.
Yeah, no, I was referring to, there's
In
that
the
actual trial, there's that very famous footage of the verdict,
where
and
he
Kardashian
is just shocked, like stunned, like
And not
I
in a
can't
good way.
believe it. Not in a good way.
Yeah.
No, there was no smile in those eyes or that mouth when you actually saw him, and OJ was like double taken, like
He was shocked too. I mean, they
he
both
was shocked,
were equally
but then
shocked.
in a smiling way. I mean, he was definitely happy with that shock, whereas Kardashian was definitely not happy.
Yeah, it's almost like he had hoped that, the jury would see through all of the circus.
There would be justice.
Yeah.
He would have fought hard to get him a lighter sentence, but I think he expected him to be convicted because he believed that OJ was guilty. The reason why Laura and I can say that OJ Simpson killed Nicole and Ron Goldman is because there was a civil trial. And in that trial, they made a determination that OJ was legally responsible for the deaths of Nicole and Ron. And so that's what we're talking about here. We believe that the criminal trial proved that he was guilty in the first instance, but he got acquitted in that. But he didn't get acquitted in the civil trial. But in the end, the very end of the show, they went through basically, they showed pictures of the different players in the show. And of course, OJ was convicted of armed robbery, and he's got a very stiff sentence, but he's up for parole in 2017. Given, what do you think, Laura, given his history in terms of being able to talk his way out of things, you think he's going to be able to get out on parole so soon?
Well, I mean, he is one of the masters when you look at the way that he can manipulate people. And, I'm sure that all of his pattern, the way that he puts his manipulative case, and, anyone can look at some of the interviews that he's done where he can, stitch together a completely different narrative, and people do want to believe him. So it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, the timing of this is interesting, and obviously him being eligible for parole, but that doesn't mean to say he's going to get it. But we'll see what happens.
Get out at some point, that's for sure.
He will do.
And then the very last pictures that they showed were pictures of Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman. And it was so tragic seeing them, because these pictures were of them smiling, just so happy. And to know the tragic ending that they met, the violent, tragic ending that they met, it always gets me. It used to get me when I was a profiler. When we were studying cases, we start with victimology. You learn everything about the victim, and then you realize when you're starting to get to know them and like them and understand them as people, and then you realize, oh, that's right, they wouldn't be here unless something horrible happened to them, and then you learn those tragic circumstances. So it's just I'm really happy that they ended with that.
Well, I have a mixed view on it. I would have liked them right up front, because that's the first time they get humanised. That's the first time they become people. And, there's the creative part to this show of how do you do that. But I actually think that, what they look like and bringing their characters to life rather than what the defence did, which was just assassinate them, is really important. And having, like you, Jim, I've given thousands of training sessions to law enforcement all around the world. And whenever I talk about a case, I have the picture of the person behind me. Because unfortunately, if you don't do that, and if you don't humanise them and talk about who they are, then they get missed from a process, in inverted commas. We do the same when we're doing a domestic homicide review. It was something that I felt strongly about writing in the guidance, that when you are sat reviewing a case, you sit there with pictures of the victims in front of you, so that you remember exactly what they're about. And I'm afraid I still feel that even though that went up at the end, that they were not given, a humanised context at all throughout this whole show. What I also would have liked to have seen was, something about if you've been a victim of domestic violence or stalking, and I think FX failed to do that, which again is a huge missed opportunity, and it's about social responsibility and taking these things seriously.
Absolutely. Yeah, that did surprise me as well, that, maybe throughout the series that could have been the coda at the end of every episode.
Yeah, where's the donation to the foundations? That's what I would have liked to have seen up there, signposting victims, but also making sure that the legacy of these two victims live on and putting them back at centre stage. And I do feel they should have been humanised far earlier on.
Oh, yeah, I agree that they should have been earlier, but the fact is that they didn't do that in this dramatic presentation. But I was glad that at the very least they ended with Ron and Nicole, and that's who this entire case should have been about.
And it was very reflective of them being a footnote, because they're right there at the end, when everything else, all the drama and everything's played out, and, oh, this is what. So you can read it two different ways. And for me, I'm afraid, I have it right up front whenever I'm doing a presentation, honouring their lives, learning from their deaths. And they're present throughout that process. And of course, with this show, you have the very beginning where you just see them being taken out in body bags, so you never get a visualization of them. Even in Nicole's house, you don't get any visualization of them. You get no pictures at any point, which they could have done actually in a creative way, just to put it into people's heads exactly who they were.
Well, hopefully next time you'll be the one calling those shots, and victims will be remembered right from the start.
Well, while the FX series may be over, I don't think we're done talking about this. There's still a few things that really need to be fleshed out.
Yeah,
don't
we
you think?
need to talk about the civil trial and all the interviews that OJ gave. Some of the jurors gave interviews later on in time. There's a lot that happened after the verdict.
And Dr. Lee. We have to talk about
Harry
Dr. Lee.
Yeah. Well, we have to talk about what the theories are about who may have helped OJ commit this crime. And so we'll be back.
Yep, you'll have to tune in and next time.
So thank you very much for this great discussion, ladies, and thank you for listening to Real Crime Profile.
For advice or support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0207 840 8960 or go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, shelter, safety or counselling, call the Genesis 24-hour hotline 214-946-4357 or go on the website www.genesisshelter.org, or you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline on 800 799 7233.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan, engineered by Jacob Moose Molin. Music is composed and performed by Simba Sumba. Logo art by Rob Cohen. Real Crime Profile is produced and recorded at Empire Studios LA by XG Productions. Real Crime Profile is distributed by Wondery.